We're now resuming at line 43 of the code that we've been working through. We've created our main window object and we've created a whole bunch of frames, or we will be as we're going through these for loops. The next step that we need to make is to add to the frame an entry period or a solid period, depending on if the cell that we're looking at is one where we can enter a value, or if the cell that we're looking at is one where we're just displaying something that's to start off the puzzle and that shouldn't really be changed. The additional thing, you'll see that we have three cases here, an if statement, an else if statement, and an else statement. The three cases we're breaking into, the else if and the else, are the case we just discussed. Is this something where I can enter a value, or is this something where I should be displaying a value? And the initial if statement is going to format the cell to have a blue background if it is the case that this cell is a surrounded cell. So one of the helper functions that you will be asked to write is an isSurrounded function, and that function has been defined outside of this cell that we're working in, and it's a function that takes in an individual cell and checks to see whether or not that cell is surrounded. If it is, this function returns true, and if it is not, then this function returns false. So if the cell that we are currently looking at is surrounded, then I want to create an object that I'm going to call label, and the type of object that label is an entry object, because we are able to make an entry at this position in the window. And then we're going to call that entry constructor with a couple of different values that I want to walk you through. The first one we've seen before. To whom does the entry belong? And the entry in this case belongs to the frame. So the frame is just a spot in the grid, and then the entry is going to belong to that spot. What that's going to do is inherit this positioning of the frame object for this entry object that we've called label. So that's the first condition. To whom does this object belong? The second here, the BG stands for background, and that's an attribute of the entry that allows me to control the background color. And there are lots of different ways that you can format this, but most of your common colors, you can just type them in between quotation marks, and that will set the background color to that color. So if a cell is surrounded, we want it to appear blue. And the last object that we have here is the width. How wide do I want this entry object to be? And there's a default here, but what we want to do is override that default and say, I want this to be 2 wide. So the 2 here is standing for, I want it to be 2 characters wide. Since we're working with Numbrix puzzles where we're entering in numbers from 1 to 81, we want to err on the side of the accommodating and have cells that could hold 2 digits here. So that's what we've done. Created an entry object and called it label, and we formatted it to have a blue background in this particular circumstance where the cell is surrounded. I'll talk about this line 45, and there's a similar line 48, last, because that's where we'll be headed in the next video. So let's skip line 45 for now, and let's look at this else if. This else if is checking to see whether or not the value of the cell is a 0, because remember, a 0 is indicating that we don't know what value goes there yet for our Numbrix puzzle. So this is checking, do we have a 0 in that position? Because if we do, then we want to create an entry spot here where we're allowed to enter a value because we don't know it yet. So just as we did in line 44, we create an entry object called label. It belongs to the frame, and the only difference is I haven't set the background to be blue because we don't have that hint associated with this particular entry. And again, we want it to be 2 wide. And then we've got line 48, which we'll talk about in a moment. Line 49 is our else statement. If the position is not 0 and we're not surrounded, then that means there's a numerical value here to start this puzzle, in which case it's a clue. It's not something that we want our user to be tampering with. And so instead of creating an entry object, we're going to create a label object, which is just going to display some text. Again, this label object needs to belong to the frame so that it's placed correctly in the window. And the last thing we have here is a text option. So this text option is saying, well, what do you want it to say? And what we want to do is this text option needs to take in a string, but we don't really want to pass it a string. We want to pass it a numerical value. So there's a workaround for that in Python called an f-string, which is kind of formatting the string based on what it sees. So what we really want the string to be is the value of the current cell, because that's what we want displayed. So we use this little f-string shortcut where we put an f before the quotation marks, and then we use these braces to indicate that we want to change from being an actual string to something else. So Python looks at what's inside those braces and says, ah, you want me to use Python code here to take a look at cells at I at j and look at the value. And then you just want to convert that to a string so that I can call it text and kind of work with the Tkinter package here. So that's what this f-string is doing. I'll put some documentation online about f-strings. And last but not least here in line 51 is that in each case, the if, the else if, and the else, we created an object called label. We created it. We did not yet actually tie it to the frame. Just like in line 42, we had to actually attach the frame to the window. In line 51, no matter what case we were in, we created an object called label. And no matter what, when all of the checking on the formatting is done, we want to take that thing called label, be it an entry or a label, and we want to add it to the frame. And the shortcut for that is just pack. So this line right here, line 51, is applying to each of these cases. Whatever you created, you called it label, let's actually add it to the frame with this pack command.